The United States Army official history of the campaign, Okinawa, the last battle, records it in one sentence in Chapter 18. In 5 days, flame tanks of the 7th 13th Armored Flame Thrower Battalion directed more than 37,000 gallons of burning gasoline at the enemy. 5 days. The 13th of June through the 17th of June 1945, the target was the Yaeju-Dake escarpment on the Kian Peninsula, the last organized defensive line held by the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa. Naval gunfire had already worked that ridge. Corps artillery had already worked it. Neither had reached the men holding it, because the men holding it were not on the ridge. They were inside it. The escarpment was a wall of jagged coral and limestone cut with ravines, described in the official history as a twisted mass of rocky ridges with cross ridges sticking out like bones from a fish spine. General Mitsuru Ushijima had put his headquarters in a cave dug into the southern face of Hill 89, a position known as Mabuni. Around him, across the escarpment and across Hills 95, 89, 115 and 153, his troops were dug into a system that had already defeated every conventional weapon the 10th Army owned. That system is the reason this story exists, so it needs to be understood before the tanks are. The Japanese defense on Okinawa was built on the reverse slope. Most fortifications were sited behind the hill crests rather than on the forward faces. An American artillery observer standing on the ground to the north could see the crest and nothing beyond it. Indirect fire cannot be adjusted onto a target that cannot be observed. The shells landed on the crest, on the forward face, on the empty rock, and the defenders sat behind the hill and waited for the barrage to lift. They waited underground. The cave mouths cut into that coral were small, some of them no more than 2 feet square. An artillery spotter searching a hillside was looking for an opening the size of a dinner tray at ranges where the entire hill was a smudge. The chance of a shell entering that opening by direct hit was close to nothing, and the embrasures doubled as entrances and exits, so there was no separate larger doorway to find. The caves were not independent. They were mutually supporting. Flanking caves and rear caves covered the mouths of the caves in front of them, so any infantry team that worked its way up to a single entrance to place a charge was firing into one hole, while 2 other holes fired into their backs. Many of the systems were interconnected by tunnel, which meant a gun crew that drew attention in one position could walk to another position and reappear somewhere. The artillery was not looking. Some tunnels had secondary exits, which meant that surrounding a position was not the same as trapping the men in it. Layered into that were the Okinawan tombs, traditional island burial vaults built of concrete in a lyre shape, set into hillsides across the south of the island. Thousands of them were reinforced and turned into fighting positions, tied into the cave network, camouflaged against the hillside, invisible until the moment they opened fire, and offering instant shelter and a firing platform in the same structure. This was doctrine, not improvisation. General Ushijima had thrown out the Imperial Army playbook that had been used at Tarawa, at Guam, at Peleliwi. He abandoned the decisive beach battle, the Suihei Gekimetsu Sen, and refused to contest the landings at all. His chosen method was Jikyusen, attrition defense in depth. He would not try to hold ground. He would try to make the 10th Army pay for every yard of it, for as long as possible, from underground, buying time for the defense of the Japanese home islands. His chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, pushed repeatedly for the traditional mass counterattack. His operations officer, Colonel Yahara, argued for pure attrition defense. Ushijima approved Cho's counterattack in early May, but after it failed he went back to Yahara's method, keeping the army in the rock. There was a second layer to that decision. By refusing the beaches, Ushijima also removed his army from the reach of the American fleet. Naval gunfire and carrier aircraft had broken every previous island garrison that tried to hold a shoreline. An army that started the battle several miles inland, underground, and behind reverse slopes was an army that the guns offshore could not usefully shoot at. The withdrawal to the Shuri line, and later the withdrawal to the Kian Peninsula, were both moves away from the sea and deeper into rock. The result was the stalemate. Some 60,000 American troops landed at Hagushi Beach on the 1st of April 1945 and walked inland against almost no resistance. The fight began on the 8th of April, and then it did not move. Along the Shuri Line, a fortified crescent roughly 10 miles across anchored on Shuri Castle. An American army with total command of the sea and the air spent weeks failing to advance against an enemy it could not see. The weapon that eventually reached into that rock had been developed and demonstrated in Hawaii in late 1944. It was not an army project alone. The design work was done by Navy Seabees, machinist's mate First Class A.A. Reich, and electrician's mate Second Class Joseph Kissel, working alongside the Army Chemical Warfare Service. What they demonstrated was a flame projector fitted inside a medium tank, and the official designation the Okinawa variant carried was the POAC WS-H1. The projector itself was a Ronson type, a Canadian design, and the reason it went into a tank at all was that the alternative had already been tried and had already failed. Flame was not a new answer to the cave problem. The 10th Army had man-portable flamethrowers, and infantry had been using them against Okinawan caves since April. The trouble was the arithmetic of the man carrying one. He hauled roughly 70 pounds of fuel on his back, and his weapon reached about 40 yards. To use it, he had to walk to within 40 yards of a cave mouth, across open coral, in full view of the flanking caves that covered that mouth, wearing a fuel tank. Flamethrower operators were identified and shot before they reached firing range repeatedly. The weapon worked. Getting it to the target did not. Putting the same chemistry inside a Sherman changed one variable, and the one variable was survivability on the approach. The vehicle could absorb small arms fire. The operator could not. It carried more than 4 times the fuel a man could, and at best conditions it could stand off out to 150 yards instead of 40. The engineering choice at the centre of it was severe. The 75mm cannon was taken out of the turret entirely. The flame projector was not bolted to the hull, not fitted in place of the bow machine gun, not carried outside as an add-on. It was inserted into the 75mm gun tube itself, in place of the cannon. The tank gave up its main armament to gain its flame. That decision cost the vehicle its ability to fight tanks or knock out a bunker with high explosive. It bought 2 things. First, endurance and volume, because the space the gun and its ammunition had occupied could now hold fuel. The turret basket was removed to make room, and 2 internal tanks, one in the hull and one in the turret, carried 290 gallons of thickened fuel. Second, and this mattered more than the engineers expected, it bought deception. From the outside, from 100 yards away, through a 2-foot embrasure, a POAC WS-H1 was indistinguishable from any other M4 Sherman. A Japanese gun crew watching American armor come up a draw could not tell which vehicle was a gun tank and which one was going to spray the hillside. They learned to tell only by watching the first shot. The fuel was not raw gasoline. It was 94% gasoline mixed with 6% napalm powder, aluminum naphenate, which thickened the mixture into a gel. That gel is the whole point. Unthickened fuel from the same projector reached about 40 yards, because a thin stream breaks up in the air and burns off before it lands. Thickened fuel held together in flight reached 40 to 80 yards as a standard operating range, and under favourable pressure could be pushed out to 150 yards. More importantly, it stuck. It clung to coral, to timber, to whatever it hit, and it kept burning at 1500 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit instead of flashing off. The fuel was pushed by compressed carbon dioxide, held in 3 bottles mounted in the right sponson at 300 pounds per square inch. At the muzzle, an atomizer broke the gel into a spray rather than a solid rod, and an electric spark lit it. The fuel itself was mixed in Oahu and shipped ready to use, activated and blended by the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company, which produced over 250,000 gallons of napalm mixture for the theatre. Storage was not kind to it. The napalm content in shipped batches broke down over time, drifting from 6% toward 4%, and a thinner mix meant a shorter reach. There was no field mixing. The battalion did not blend its own fuel forward of the line, which meant the tanks were tied to a central refueling point at the chemical warfare depot, and the depot was tied to a supply chain that ran back to Oahu. A flame tank was never more than one long shuttle away from being an unarmed Sherman with no cannon in it. A full load was good for 60 to 80 seconds of continuous fire. Crews almost never used it that way. Fired in 1-second bursts, the same 290 gallons gave roughly 80 separate shots, which is what a crew working along a hillside of cave mouths actually needed. Once it was gone, the tank was finished for the day, or close to it. Refueling in the field took at least 90 minutes to replace the 290 gallons, plus another 15 minutes to bring the carbon dioxide system back up to pressure before the vehicle could fire again. Everything else about the vehicle was a liability, and the crews knew it. The armour was unchanged from a standard M4. The frontal plate was the same, which meant the Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun, marginal against a Sherman's front at range, was still perfectly capable at the flank and the rear at close quarters. And close quarters is exactly where the flame tank had to be, a maximum reach of 150 yards, and a realistic working reach of 40 to 80. Meant the vehicle had to drive into the effective envelope of every anti-tank weapon on the hill before it could do its job at all. The fuel system had its own failure modes. If the pressure dropped, the projector could blow back. If the ignition failed, the tank sprayed unburned napalm across the target, a pinkish gel that did nothing at all, and announced exactly what the vehicle was to everyone watching. If a fuel line leaked, the interior of the vehicle filled with the same gel it was supposed to be throwing. Then there was the weight. 290 gallons of fuel and 3 pressure bottles added mass to a vehicle that had to climb rain-soaked coral hills in an Okinawan spring. The tanks bogged constantly. Mud swallowed the tracks and the crews worked the engines and transmissions against it until they failed. Across the campaign, mechanical and terrain losses outnumbered the vehicles the Japanese destroyed. The battalion that operated them, the 13th Armored Flame Thrower Battalion, was assembled from converted vehicles on a schedule that left no margin. The conversions ran from the 25th of December 1944 to the 25th of January 1945, finishing shortly before the unit was assigned to Operation Iceberg. The battalion came ashore at Hagushi Beach on the 7th of April 1945, with 54 flame tanks, one of them lost in the landing itself, leaving 53 operational. Their first full commitment came on the 19th of April near Kakuzu Ridge, where flame tanks from Company B supported the 105th Infantry's attack on the 27th Infantry Division's eastern flank. What happened there set the pattern for the rest of the campaign. The Japanese threw every weapon they had at the flame tanks the moment they identified them, more than they had thrown at gun tanks, because the crews on the receiving end understood immediately what the vehicle did to a cave. Defenders who came out of the caves to escape the flame came out into machine gun lanes laid by American infantry. Very few surrendered in the early fighting. Later, at the end of the campaign, that would change, and it changed for the same reason. That first commitment did not break the Shuri line. Nothing did for a month. The assault opened on the 11th of May. From the 12th of May to the 21st, the 3 hills known as Sugarloaf, Chocolate Drop and Half Moon became the grinding core of the stalemate. Sugarloaf itself was assaulted roughly 11 times before it fell. Shuri Castle finally fell on the 29th of May, and on the 30th, the 32nd Army withdrew south, intact as an organisation, to the Kian Peninsula and the Yaeju-Dake escarpment. That withdrawal is the detail that shows what the 10th Army was actually up against. 19 days of fighting for one salient, a fortified crescent finally broken after 7 weeks, and the army that had been holding it simply walked south and set up again. The Kian Peninsula gave them everything the Shuri line had given them, and more of it: jagged coral, limestone caves already in the ground, wooded passages, and 2 more anchors at Yaeju-Dake and Kunishi Ridge to hold the flanks. Breaking the Shuri line had not destroyed the 32nd Army, it had relocated it. By the 20th of May, the battalion had lost 22 tanks to enemy action, with further vehicles lost to mud and mechanical failure. The Japanese had worked out how to kill them. The 47mm anti-tank gun did it at close range from the flank. Anti-tank mines did it on the approach routes, and infantry did it by hand, closing on the vehicle behind smoke screens with 22-pound satchel charges. In one sector, 6 vehicles were destroyed by satchel charges alone. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commanding the 10th Army, had a name for the method that eventually worked against the caves. He called it corkscrew and blowtorch. The blowtorch was flame. The corkscrew was demolition. Neither half functioned without the other, and neither functioned without the infantry that carried the charges and the artillery that kept the rest of the hillsides heads down while they did it. Buckner did not live to see the end of it. He was killed on the 18th of June 1945, one day after the escarpment was secured. The escarpment assault opened with the 17th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Patchelor's night attack in mid-June 1945. The 7th Infantry Division went at the escarpment and Hill 95 with the 32nd Regiment under Colonel Finn and the 17th Regiment under Colonel Patchelor. On their eastern flank, the 96th Infantry Division came on with the 381st Regiment under Colonel Halloran and the 383rd under Colonel May. The official history calls the ground perfect for armoured flamethrowers, and the phrasing matters because it is an admission about everything else. The terrain was perfect for flame precisely because it was so bad for every other weapon in the American infantry. The flame tanks moved ahead of the gun tanks. That is the reverse of normal practice, and it was deliberate. A gun tank in front would fire high explosive at a cave mouth it could barely see and achieve nothing beyond chipping coral. The flame tank in front closed to within 80 yards of a cluster of openings and put the gel into them, 1 second burst after 1 second burst, working along a face of rock. What the fuel did once it entered a cave is the reason the cave stopped functioning. The gel did not need a direct hit on a man to neutralize a position. It entered the mouth, stuck to the walls of the entrance and the passage behind it, and burned at up to 2000 degrees in an enclosed volume. It consumed the oxygen in the passage. It filled the interconnecting tunnels with heat and combustion products, which meant the great advantage of the system, the ability to move underground between firing positions, now worked against the men using it. A tunnel network that let a gun crew escape artillery carried fire and smoke to positions that had not been hit at all. The position ceased to resist, and the ones behind it often ceased with it. The men who left the caves came out into the same trap that had been waiting since April. American infantry had the exits covered with machine guns and the ground outside the mouths registered. Coming out was not survival. It was the second half of the same tactic. The official history describes seas of flame across the Hill 95 positions. Cave entrances burned out one after another, with infantry following him behind to close what remained with grenades and satchel charges. The 17th Infantry ran night attacks against sections of the escarpment, and the arithmetic of the whole thing is in that one line from Chapter 18, more than 37,000 gallons in 5 days. Set against a vehicle capacity of 290 gallons a load, and a 90-minute refuel cycle plus 15 minutes to repressurize, that figure describes a battalion running a shuttle, vehicles firing until dry, backing out of the line, taking an hour and a half at the fuel point, and going back in, over and over, for 5 consecutive days. The armour bled for it. Vehicles bogged in the mud of the ravines. Mines claimed others on the approach lanes. Satchel-charged teams came in behind smoke and killed vehicles at contact range. Once a Japanese observer identified which Sherman on the slope was the flame tank, and the only way to identify it was to watch it fire. That vehicle drew concentrated fire from every weapon on the hill that could bear. The assessment that carries the most weight on what the flame tanks did to that escarpment did not come from the 10th Army. It came from the other side. Captured Japanese diaries record that the flame tanks inflicted the greatest destruction upon our positions. Not the naval guns that had been firing since April. Not the core artillery. The tanks with the gel. Around the middle of June 1945, resistance on the Yaeju-Dake ridges was reduced by flame tanks and nothing else. On the 17th of June, the crest of Hill 95 and the Yaeju-Dake escarpment were secured by American forces. This is the point where the story is usually told wrong, so it is worth being exact. The 17th of June was not the end of the battle. It was the breach of the crest. Organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa continued for another 4 days. On the 18th of June, General Ushijima ordered a shift to guerrilla operations, which was the effective surrender of the 32nd Army as an organized force, though the fighting continued. On the 21st of June 1945, the coordinated Japanese defensive effort collapsed, and cohesive command and control ended, except for scattered pockets in southern Okinawa, near Mabuni and Madeira. Those pockets were remnants, they were not a line. At 3:40 in the morning on the 22nd of June 1945, General Mitsuru Ushijima and his Chief of Staff, General Isamu Cho, committed seppuku in the cave headquarters on the southern face of Hill 89, less than 100 feet from ground American troops were holding on the crest above them. He did not die in combat. He took his own life after the defense he had designed had stopped functioning. American patrols found the 2 bodies on the 25th of June. The island was declared secure the following day, and the 10th Army raised its flag. The battle had lasted 82 days. In the final days, Japanese soldiers began to surrender for the first time in the war in numbers that meant anything. That is worth sitting with. An army that had refused surrender at Tarawa, at Guam, at Peleliu, that had gone into the rock rather than into a beach charge, that had absorbed weeks of naval gunfire without breaking, gave up when the rock itself stopped being shelter. The 713th's final ledger runs to 85 days of combat, the 7th of April to the 30th of June 1945. In that time, the battalion was credited with 4,788 Japanese killed and 49 captured, against 8 Americans killed or missing, and 111 wounded. That is a ratio of roughly 40-1, and it needs the same precision as the 5 days does. The figure 4,788 is a credited battalion total. The word in the source is credited, not confirmed. It covers every Japanese casualty attributed to the battalion's operations across 85 days, which includes flame, tank gunfire, and the infantry work that flame made possible in coordinated assaults. It is a measure of what the unit's presence accomplished on the ground it operated over. It is not a count of men neutralized by flame alone, and anyone who presents it that way is reading the number wrong. The napalm total deserves the same treatment. The battalion's own unit history states 76,000 gallons used on Okinawa. That figure is documented. A larger claim of 200,000 gallons circulates in secondary accounts with no primary source behind it, and it does not survive contact with the arithmetic. 37,000 gallons in the 5 heaviest days of the entire campaign, against a total of 76,000 across 85 days, is internally consistent. 200,000 is not. The likely source of the inflation is a conflation with the total flamethrower fuel expended by every unit on the island from every weapon type, which ran to a far larger number. Which leaves the central question and the title's verb. Flame tanks did not destroy Japan's last line on Okinawa by themselves, and no honest account claims they did. The 7th and 96th Divisions made the assault. They took the ground, they held it. They closed the positions with grenades and demolition charges, and they took the casualties for it. Artillery and naval gunfire pounded the escarpment continuously. Conventional Shermans suppressed with high explosive and machine guns while the flame tanks worked. Every one of those elements was necessary. What the flame tanks did was solve the one problem none of the others could solve. The cave and tomb system on that escarpment was, by June of 1945, the only defensive architecture in the Pacific that had reliably defeated American firepower. Artillery could not see it. High explosive could not enter it. Infantry could not close on it without walking into interlocking fire from the caves covering the caves. It had held for 80 days. The flame tank reached into it, and the system that had made the ground unbreakable stopped working. Then the combined arms assault took the ground, which had never been possible before. Buckner's phrase captures it exactly. Blowtorch and corkscrew. Flame opened the position. Demolition and infantry finished it. Neither half was the weapon. The pairing was. The Army's own judgment on the vehicle came almost immediately. As the war ended, the United States Army cancelled further flame tank production orders. On paper, the most effective battalion of its kind in the Pacific was wound up the moment the fighting stopped. The Marine Corps read the same battle and reached the opposite conclusion. Planning for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, where every hillside was expected to be another Yaeju-Dake, the Marines ordered 72 flame tanks of their own. 70 of them were ready by the war's end. They were never used. Okinawa cost the United States roughly 49,000 casualties, including 12,500 killed or missing for one island. And that arithmetic sat directly in front of President Truman when he weighed an invasion of the home islands against the atomic bomb. The phrase used at the time was an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. The 70 flame tanks waiting for downfall were part of the answer to a question that was settled another way. What remains is the escarpment and the 5 days, a ridge of coral that had beaten every gun in the American arsenal, a defensive system that had turned an 82-day battle into the costliest campaign of the Pacific War, and a battalion of Shermans that had given up their cannon to carry gel, moving ahead of the gun tanks into the effective range of every anti-tank weapon on the hill, and putting more than 37,000 gallons of burning gasoline into holes 2 feet square. The line did not fall on the 17th of June. It fell on the 21st. And the man who built it took his own life at 3:40 on the morning of the 22nd, 100 feet below the crest that American troops were standing on. But the thing that made the line a line, the rock, the tunnels, the reverse slope, the tombs, the mutually supporting mouths that had made a hillside into a fortress, stopped being any of those things in 5 days in June.